The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The World of the Sufi by Idries Shah. 5. Therapy and the Sufi. 5 Part 1. Specialized Techniques in Central Asia by Jafar Halaji. Abstract. During a visit to Afghanistan in 1961, the author was allowed to observe the hypnotherapeutic techniques of a mystical group which appear to be uninfluenced by Western medicine. The semi-monastic Sufi practitioners differ from most healers or religious workers in that they impose no fees and attempt no proselytizing. The Sufis treat physical as well as psychosomatic disorders by a method which is reminiscent of mesmerism, and they claim cures even for illnesses such as tuberculosis and cancer. A treatment session for 18 patients was observed. The patients were assigned beds in the one-room clinic, and hypnosis was induced individually in each patient, with induction periods varying from 10 to 20 minutes. Chanting, dim lighting, hand passes, and eye fixation played a role in the induction. No attempt was made to test for the presence or depth of hypnosis. 15 patients claimed immediate cure, 1 case could not be evaluated at the time, and 2 patients seemed unaffected. It was reported to the author at a later date that these 2 initially refractory cases returned for further treatment and were cured. During a sojourn in Afghanistan in the spring of 1961, I had the opportunity of observing hypnosis among the people of an ancient culture. I feel that the following notes on my experience may contribute to a knowledge of the nature of hypnotherapy in places which have been relatively unaffected by modern developments, and hence shed some light on the historical use of this technique. The community which I observed is a semi-monastic one, known as Nakshbandi Sufis. The culture is similar to that of the yogis of India, in that the training of mind and body is stressed, while supernatural elements are rigidly excluded in practical work. Sufism has, however, a respectable literature of transcendental character, and most of the mystical poets of the Persian, Turkish, and Urdu classical periods were Sufi practitioners. Training of the Sufi practitioner is done in secret, given only to selected disciples, and it claims to be the only real occult training. Its purpose is the production of a perfect man, complete in mind and body. Disciples have to prove their fitness by undergoing tests and training. Many Sufis are known as Hakim, Doctor, meaning that they have passed through a 16-year course in their art. A description of the activities of the Sufi doctor or practitioner will be the main purpose of this paper. In the community which I observed, a clinic is held each Thursday night prior to the group devotions and exercises of the entire body. This clinic is composed of 60 devoted practitioners of the Sufi methods. The precise method of the training of practitioners for this clinic was not available. The Sufis are opposed to any investigation of their art because official medical science has not accepted their activities. They were also reluctant to let me observe their methods in a clinic because they feared that I might be associated with an official inquiry into Sufi methods. However, after these difficulties were overcome, the Pir Hakim, or elder physician, a man of about 60 years, accompanied by his 6 senior practitioners, took me to their place of operations. The clinic was a large whitewashed building which contained 1 large room and several smaller ones. The rooms were dimly lighted by oil lamps which hung by chains from the roof. In the large room, string bedsteads were arranged against the walls, each covered by a cotton quilt. During the particular night on which I was observing, there were 18 male patients, ranging in age from approximately 18 to 50. Their ailments included insomnia, headaches, indigestion, lack of appetite, impotence, undefined fears, and backache. The patients consisted of Caucasian and Semitic-type nomads, farmers, and other local residents. Most of them appeared to be uneducated. Each applicant was first seen by the chief and his assistants in one of the small rooms and then assigned a bed in the clinic. After the patient had been assigned a bed, he lay on his back with his eyes fixed upon one of a number of octagonal mouldings. Set in the ceiling, these mouldings were embellished with a 9-pointed diagram. The chief practitioner and his assistants now visited each bed in turn. While the rest of the group maintained a chant of the syllables Yahu, Yahuk, the chief passed his hands, held together with palms downward, horizontally over the patient. His hands were held about 6 inches above the patient's body and passed with a rhythmic movement from the eyes to the toes. The technique thus resembled that of the mesmerists. An integral part of the proceedings was that the chief practitioner rhythmically blew upon the patient at a rate of about 2 breaths a second. It is this aspect of the procedure which is responsible for its name, chuf, or breathing. The hypnogenic effect of this technique is probably facilitated by the relaxation of the body, the warmth of the room, the patient's concentration upon the diagram, and the occasional interruption of the light when the palms are passed across the face. The subjects appeared to enter a hypnotic state in about 6 minutes. The induction, however, continued for an average of about 12 minutes with younger patients. In the case of patients over about 40, up to 20 minutes was usual. Not all of the patients closed their eyes. Rather, a sharp intake of breath and cessation of minor bodily movement generally signaled the onset of hypnosis for these patients. However, no attempt was made to test for the presence or depth of hypnosis. After the long period needed to deal thus with each of the 18 patients, the party of practitioners sat down on a bench in the middle of the room while more lights were brought. Tea was now served to the operators, and for half an hour conversation in low tones with me was permitted. I was assured that the patients were now unconscious, although no verbal suggestions of sleep had been given. The practitioners also informed me that the patients had not known what the nature of the treatment would be before coming to the clinic, because all patients who had ever been treated here were cautioned when first interviewed that they should not repeat to anyone, on pain of recurrence of their malady, the form which the therapy took. At the end of this half-hour period, the practitioners again visited each case in turn. A small gong was beaten once near the patient's head. If he did not stir, the chief, reading the symptoms from a piece of paper, informed him that the curative powers of Baraka were entering him, would continue to work in him, were curing him in every possible way, and would complete the cure before he woke up. This was repeated 5 times. During this phase of the procedure, the chief made 2 occult references. The first was that the clinic was Haikal-i-Kab, the Temple of Sleep, and the other was that the healing took place by virtue of curative power transmitted through the sanctity of the founder of the order of Sufis, Sheikh Bahuddin Nakshband. If, however, the patient did stir or move when the gong sounded, he was told that at the end of the proceedings he should rouse himself and return the following Thursday evening for further treatment. He was instructed to lie still meanwhile until the proceedings were finished. Of the total, 2 patients were evidently not in hypnosis. All were eventually awakened by being shaken by the shoulder and by being told to rouse themselves. They then kissed the hand of the chief and were sent to another building where they were fed and allowed to stay until morning. The mandate to teach the technique is still held by the Hashemite family, of which Muhammad was a member, and the present chiefs who maintain this mandate are the three senior male members of the family, the princes Iqbal Ali Shah, Idries Shah, and Omar Ali Shah. Their hypnotic knowledge and power thus can be seen as deriving from three sources: that they are Sufi practitioners, which gives them the curative power of Bahudin, that they are tribal chiefs, and that they are Sayyids, descendants of Muhammad. The following day, the patients were again examined for symptoms, and 15 claimed that they were cured. The 16th, the case of impotence, withheld judgment as to his state of health until his return to his village. According to an informant, the two unsuccessful cases were subsequently hypnotized. It is stated that their maladies, insomnia and migraine, were at that time banished. The Sufi method of treatment seems to differ from most other religious healing methods in certain respects. Despite the fact that the practitioners are viewed as holy men, I observed no Sufi propaganda being offered to the patients. The practitioners themselves maintained that their method of cure differs from techniques of faith healing, such as the Orthodox Islamic, in the sense that the patients are not expected to have faith that they will be cured by the treatment. Further, although one might expect that the practitioners would receive some kind of payment for their services, they accepted no gifts beyond the amount of food which could be held in the palm of one hand. According to the chief practitioner, cases of cancer, tuberculosis, and poisoning had been successfully treated by Sufi methods, though it was sometimes necessary to hypnotize a patient as many as 300 times before effecting a cure. It was also claimed that numerous referrals to the Sufi method had been cases which defied treatment by physicians trained in the West. As far as could be ascertained, there was no knowledge of hypnosis as used in the West, and no member of the community had any knowledge of any foreign language other than Persian. The books in their library were exclusively classical ones or poetry. The chief practitioner claimed that the Sufi method of treatment originated in the 12th century, but had been used for many centuries prior to that by certain Sufi masters. This hypnotic technique of treatment is claimed to have been brought to Afghanistan by a family of descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. This claim may be somewhat substantiated by the historical incident in AD 620, in which Muhammad placed his son-in-law and companion Ali, subsequently the fourth caliph, into a trance and was able to withdraw without pain a fragment of a lance which was embedded in his thigh. 5 Part 2 Nazaridine Looks at Mental Health by Marjorie A. Bancroft. Let us put it to the doctors. What is mental illness? When that famous figure of Eastern folklore, Mullah Nasruddin, was challenged by the philosophers, logicians, and doctors of law for having dared to call them ignorant and confused, he confronted them in court and asked them each and every one to write an answer to the question, "What is bread?" The answers described bread as being anything from a food to a gift of God, to baked dough, to changeable according to how you mean bread, down to nobody really knows. Nasruddin remarked, "When they decide what bread is, it will be possible for them to decide other things." How can one pretend to cure what has never been satisfactorily, let alone unanimously, defined, least of all by those supposedly responsible for its treatment? And if by mental illness we refer to ingrained aberrant and destructive or self-destructive methods of coping with life, Leaving aside periodic depressions or other temporary problems, we immediately perceive that success in this field is hardly overwhelming. This fact alone should surely encourage us to stand back and examine not only our methods of dealing with mental illness, at best rarely effective, but our attitudes, individual and collective, which daily and over the generations shape those methods. Are modern medicine and psychiatry sufficient? It would appear not. Yet do we ever consider treating mental illness outside their confines? When someone noticed Nazaridine looking for something on the ground and asked him what he had lost, Nazaridine replied it was his key. The neighbour helped him look and asked exactly where it had been dropped. "In my house," Nazaridine told him. The neighbour then asked what he was doing looking outside. "Oh, there is more light here than inside my house," he said. So with us. That aspect of our culture predominantly concerned with developing rational, analytical thought has generally neglected the possibility that there is another way of dealing with the world. Consequently, our left hemisphere-oriented society is making great strides technologically in many fields, lighting up Nazaridine's garden with brilliant electric sunshine, while the keys to so many of our dilemmas besides mental illness remain lost in the shadows of a more efficient, but necessarily less intellectual manner of dealing with our problems. Modern psychiatry, of course, would frown on this attitude, though ironically established scientific thought and psychology, psychiatry and pop psychology in particular, have often found themselves at odds. But is there not a certain amount of intellectual snobism in the idea that other ways of treating mental illness, not to be found in psychology books, are necessarily exotic drivel founded on unscientific principles? When Nazaridine in his ferry boat was asked by a learned pedagogue whether the journey would be rough, he replied, "Don't ask me nothing about it." The pedagogue inquired whether he had ever studied grammar, and being told no, informed Nazaridine that half his life had been wasted. When a sudden storm later threatened to capsize the ferry, Nazaridine asked the teacher whether he had ever learnt to swim. He had not, it appeared. "Then all your life has been wasted. We are sinking," said Nazaridine. In short, it is not necessarily the universities or the medical colleges which are teaching us how to cope with our survival as integrated, constructive and healthy individuals. There is another school, that of experience. One could do worse than read Bacon on this point. Nor is there any reason whatsoever to suppose that it is only the experiences of members of this society or Western culture in general which are of importance or ultimate use to us in this regard. If we could admit that we have failed, and certainly in the case of mental illness I believe we must. The World Health Organization states that 10 times as many people were mad in 1975 as in 1900, even allowing for population growth. Then surely it is only a healthy humility which could lead us to investigate whether other cultures at other periods in history have perhaps had more success than we ourselves. Psychiatrists would not appreciate that such primitive societies as the African Zulu tribes, American Indians, and others had evolved a more sophisticated approach to certain aspects of mental illness than modern medicine. Yet a former anthropologist turned psychotherapist has adapted, from these cultures, a trance therapy technique for modern victims of anorexia nervosa, a disease notorious for its almost entirely negative response to hospital therapy of any kind. He has since achieved considerable success among a large percentage of his patients, more than can be said of any legitimate psychiatrist practicing today. The therapy, furthermore, appears to possess a previously unsuspected but convincing mathematical basis, as outlined by Professor Deikman in the condensed exposition of his Introduction to Catastrophe Theory, in the April 1976 issue of Scientific American. And if the mass of the populace could reduce the jargon of the Freudians, Jungians, and others to their simplest precepts, would they have any interest or belief in these doctrines at all? Or is it their very obscurity which inspires a certain respect from afar? When a sage from the Far East visited Nasruddin's village, he began philosophizing abstrusely and at great length until Nasruddin interrupted him, saying that he must tell of his own adventures as a spiritual teacher. After the sage had impatiently sat through tale after tale of Nasruddin's marvelous reception in far-off lands, he finally asked abruptly if no one had ever opposed the mullah's views. "Oh yes," he replied. It appeared that in one village he had been beaten and driven away. The sage asked why. "They understood the language I was speaking in," Nasruddin replied. The sage then asked about all the villages where he had been received with such enthusiasm. "Oh, they only spoke Kurdish. I was safe as long as I stayed with them." In the case of the more extreme branches of psychology, from shock treatment to primal therapy, it is more the jargon, it is the novelty and the alien approach which hook so many followers who are not, after all, so very different from the avid converts to today's cults, sects, and pseudo-Eastern religions. Indeed, the memberships of the two reputedly different bodies overlap a good deal. Nasruddin was once stealing apricots in an orchard when the gardener approached. He immediately climbed a tree. When the gardener asked him what he was doing, he replied, "Singing. I am a nightingale." The gardener then invited him to sing, and was amused to hear the painfully unmusical sounds the mullah came out with. "That isn't like any nightingale I've ever heard," he smiled. "Then you obviously haven't travelled," replied Nasruddin with hauteur. "I chose the song of a very rare and exotic nightingale." Another problem, apart from a tendency to intellectualize experiences, which anyone who has ever suffered from mental illness will confirm are not at all intellectual, is the tendency of psychiatrists to apply blanket treatment. If they are Freudians, then they administer Freudian analysis within its strictest boundaries, whether or not that is what the particular patient in question happens to need. The same is true of all the other specialist branches of psychology. Even the eclectics are generally limited by the concept of modern psychiatry itself. Perhaps psychiatrists are simply incapable of approaching patients from outside the confines of one strictly defined, intensely studied field, or of a mixture of two or more. Or there may be a fear that they would be considered inconsistent if they dealt with individual patients in different ways, resembling the man who had heard so much of Mullah Nasruddin as a sage, and therefore journeyed a great distance to visit him, and was totally repulsed by the shocking inconsistency of a man who, in the cold of winter, used his breath 1 minute to warm his hands, and the next minute to cool a bowl of soup. "Undoubtedly a fraud," thought the man as he left. And if this is the case, the psychiatrist may well be right, in that we are probably no more perceptive than Nasruddin's visitor, and would, indeed, condemn such inconsistency on their part. But that is scarcely a laudable excuse for failing to deal constructively, open-mindedly, and efficiently with such a disabling enemy of humanity as mental illness. It is surely the restrictions governing the limited knowledge encompassed by psychiatry and medicine as a whole, a difficulty compounded by an often grudging slowness on the part of the doctors and psychiatrists themselves to admit these limitations, especially in comparison with our technological achievements, which prevent us from actually seeing how little we know. It is like the man whom Nasruddin offered to teach Kurdish, although he knew only a few words of the language himself. Nazaridine started off with the word for hot soup, and was promptly asked how one said cold soup. "Oh, you never say that in Kurdish," Nazaridine replied. "The Kurds only ever eat their soup hot." Which is, in one sense, similar to the psychiatrists telling patients that there is nothing wrong with them apart from normal periods of acute depression, simply because the patient's problems do not fit in with their own preconceived ideas or definitions of mental illness. It may even be this very fact which contributes to many suicides. Officially, there is nothing wrong with so many people, yet interior pain and pressure mount to such a degree that the limits of their endurance are surpassed. Nazaridine, in the doctor's waiting room, was repeating loudly over and over, "I hope I'm very ill," and demoralizing the other patients. When he saw the doctor, he almost shouted at him that he only hoped he was very ill. "Why?" asked the doctor. "I would hate to think that anyone who feels as I do has nothing wrong with them," exclaimed the mullah. Today's victim of mental illness is, in fact, in a rather desperate situation. No one really seems to know what to do in practical terms, apart from prescribing drugs, which is consequently done with absolutely alarming regularity and abandon, though everyone is convinced that his own therapy, however limited, is the best available. Like Nazaridine, one may decide to opt for the approach best described as 3 heads are better than 1. When he was ill, he visited first one physician who prescribed a purgative, decided on a second opinion and found another doctor who ordered an operation, then found still a third who insisted he needed massage. "There's the answer," said Mullah Nazaridine. 1/3 of a cut, 1/3 of a purge, and 1/3 of a massage ought to clear things up in no time. I mentioned earlier that despite psychiatry's obvious failure to come to grips with mental illness, no one seemed to consider treating the one outside the confines of the other. Now, does this arise solely from our conditioned attitudes toward the idea that anything else would be weird, or esoteric, or superstitious? Or is it simply because there is no other way to deal with mental illness? Nazaridine once walked into a shop full of various odds and ends. "Do you have any nails?" he asked the shopkeeper. It happened that he did. "Any decent leather?" That too. "Twine?" There was some. "And dye?" That as well. "Then why don't you make yourself a pair of boots?" Nazaridine asked. On another occasion, the mullah was heard to mutter to himself, "If I knew what 2 and 2 were, I would say 4. In short, it is not moaning about what is not being done that gets something done. Rather, it is examining the tools and material at our disposal, and then conscientiously searching for the knowledge that will allow us to make our own boots, so that we are no longer dependent on pills, weekly visits to the shrink, alcohol, an inflated standard of living, or constantly excessive exterior stimulation of one kind or another in order to hold us together. The individual has his own contribution to make. When a group of friends went hunting, Nazaridine was given the slowest horse and was left well behind the rest. When it began to rain, the mullah simply got off his horse, removed his clothes and sat on them, partly sheltered by the horse, until the rain had stopped. Then he put on his dry clothes and joined the others, who had tried to dash for shelter and consequently became soaked. "It must have been the horse you gave me," said a dry Nazaridine, in answer to their amazed stares. So the next day his host took the slowest horse, and Nazaridine the swiftest one. When it rained again, Nazaridine did as he had done before, while his host, on the slow nag, got even wetter than before. When he returned, he shouted at Nazaridine that it was all his fault for getting him to ride such a slow horse. "Maybe," suggested Mullah Nazaridine, "you did not contribute something of your own to the problem of remaining dry." As a well-known London specialist once remarked, a doctor is only as good a doctor as he is a person. Certainly medical and psychiatric training today is flawed insofar as this is a factor it stubbornly refuses to take into account. Thus, for every medical person of real perception, there may actually be numerous blind automatons. Nazaridine was once with a sick friend when the doctor arrived, and was stunned when, after only looking at the patient's tongue, the doctor said, "When you stop eating green apples, you'll be fine again." "How did you do it?" he asked the doctor later. "Simple, when you've had enough experience," he replied. "When I realized there was nothing more serious than a stomachache involved, I looked about for a cause, and noted a pile of green apple cores under his bed, so it was quite obvious." The next time Nazaridine went to visit a sick friend, the wife told him abruptly they needed a doctor, not a philosopher, but Nazaridine eagerly pushed his way forward. First thing off, he looked under the bed. "Nothing to worry about," he said to the wife. "He'll be fine as soon as he cuts down on this habit he has of eating saddles and bridles." And if you think that is too silly and unsophisticated a story to apply to modern medicine, I have an anecdote of my own to relate. A ballet teacher I know was once stricken with a puzzling and painful illness about which she naturally consulted her doctor. "Malaria," he said. "But it can't be," she replied in astonishment. "From everything I know about malaria, the symptoms just don't fit at all." He shook his head sadly. "Pity," he said. "I've never had a case of it. It would have been nice." The recent tendency when it comes to searching for the causes of mental illness, particularly with the advent of transactional analysis, primal therapy, the anti-Spockians, and so forth, is to put the blame on the upbringing of the child, on the parents, in fact. Now, is this fair, accurate, or helpful? Nazaridine was once trying to get a terribly stubborn calf inside a pen, and ended up by shouting at the mother. Someone asked him why. Nazaridine answered, "It's her fault anyway. Why couldn't she have taught him better?" So, in fact, many psychologists and psychiatrists are, like Nazaridine, blaming the mother or father for not teaching the child to do either A, what the parents themselves never knew how to do, or B, were only so effectively conditioned that they did it automatically. In the second case, should we not rather encourage the independence of the child from our conditioning systems, if this independence does not hurt others, but instead actually helps him develop to such a point that he progresses beyond behavioral problems or mental illness and can operate as a healthy and effective human being? Guilt seems to lie at the root of every known mental illness. In an intriguing story entitled The Burden of Guilt, we are given some clearer insight into how the mechanism operates in almost all normal individuals, and in a far more extreme degree, in disturbed and deranged individuals. Nazaridine and his wife returned home one day only to find that they had had burglars, and that virtually everything in their house was gone. "You're the one to blame," said his wife. "You ought to have checked that it was all locked up." The neighbours joined in. "You don't even have the windows locked," said one. "Why didn't you anticipate a break-in?" said another. "You never replace those faulty locks," put in a third. "Hold on," Nazaridine said finally. "It isn't only my fault." "And who's to blame then?" they all cried. "Well," said Nazaridine, "for a start, what about the thieves?" Here we have it in a nutshell. Every conceivable interior and exterior voice is constantly shouting at us, "It's all your fault, you're bad, you're wrong, you should, you shouldn't," and so forth. What has been stolen from us? Perhaps our real faculties of perception, the ones that would enable us to see things as they really are, without the bias of continual and almost incomprehensibly powerful conditioning that, in the short as in the long term, affects our every observation, action, and reaction, and therefore be in a position accurately to assess our situation, and if it is an unhealthy one, to remedy it. And because of these constant voices, be they the internal or external voices of our parents, of television and other media, of our conscience or that of others, we feel so guilty that we are paralyzed when it comes to developing our potential or dealing with our problems. If, on the other hand, we take Nazaridine's attitude, namely that instead of sitting there feeling guilty, we could point a finger at the real culprits, the thieves, we are then in a position of relative psychological freedom from guilt pressures, freedom which may allow us to make an effort to search for, identify, and apprehend the thieves, thereby recovering our stolen faculties. In the absence of the strength or ability to do this, we would be well advised to search out people with some knowledge about catching thieves. Unfortunately, psychiatrists do not tend to be such people. I submit, as a hypothesis, that in the case of mental illness, the normal guilt of the individual, usually quite sufficient to prevent him from realizing his real potential or doing anything more efficient in his life than being a consumer, is distorted and exaggerated to such an extent that the resultant anxiety cripples the individual. To face that guilt head-on would provoke a confrontation with what has variously been described as the whole, primal pain, suicidal panic depressions, the demon of self-hate, the devil, particularly as Doris Lessing has pointed out in the case of mystics of the Christian tradition, hell, and so forth. The normal individual finds that the usual distractions of everyday life, food, work, TV, radios and newspapers, sex, alcohol, legal and illicit drugs, fighting with one's spouse or family, fashion, holidays, books, pets, and so on, are all he needs to avoid confronting his inner self for most of his life. If, however, the person attempts to do nothing at all for any period of time, or to deprive himself of his normal, excessive daily intake of external stimulation, he then finds he is not nearly so balanced and calm as he had imagined. Most people, in fact, have projects they would like to, and imagine they should, work on, but instead, on arriving home, they pick up the newspaper, turn on the TV, and think about what they'll have for dinner. As I see it, in the case of the victim of mental illness, such escape is not so simple. A more and more elaborate series of defense systems is erected to close off the possibility of any internal confrontation. A study of the illness Anorexia Nervosa is particularly useful and instructive in this regard. Here, the incredible guilt over eating and being fat, a great deal of it incidental conditioning on the part of modern society, reaches such a fever pitch that to an anorexic, putting on even 1 or 2 pounds involves experiencing such a harrowing near confrontation with the root of the guilt that the effort to lose weight is redoubled and intensified. The mere prospect of weighing 20 pounds more than his present weight, a conceivable if not pleasant idea in the mind of the normal person, represents a surpassed pain threshold of such agony that perhaps the only possible solution would be, and sometimes is, suicide. Anorexia nervosa is an excellent illustration of this precept because the guilt is so clear and undisguised. In paranoiacs, it seems fairly obvious that to avoid feeling the guilt themselves, they project it onto those around them. With schizophrenics, the division is conceivably a way of escaping the guilt by leaping from one personality or world to another whenever one is threatened, and so on. Since 1952, drugs have been employed as the single most powerful weapon in the battle against mental illness. Analeptics, antidepressants, and tranquilizers are given out by the handful daily to virtually every patient in mental institutes over the Western world. Painkillers, sleeping pills, and amphetamines, many of them addictive and harmful in the long run, are also subject to widespread abuse by the population at large. yet the benefits of drugs in either category are highly questionable. The first three are widely prescribed for schizophrenics, manic depressives, and others with severe psychological disturbances. Yet Dr. Erwin Lausch reports, "The most significant effect of the new drugs, however, is surely the attitude of the healthy to their mentally sick fellow beings. Slowly but irresistibly, recognition is gaining ground that the mentally sick should not be treated as lepers, bear no guilt for their sickness, and are not hopeless cases." It would rather seem as though the effect of the patients taking the pills is that the rest of us start behaving like normal human beings. It calls to mind the story where Nazaridine stole a bull and killed it, taking the animal's skin as well. When the owner discovered this and began crying out and wailing, "Strange case of cause and effect," thought the mullah. "I kill a bull, and the owner acts as though he were being flayed." Rather than treating the victims of mental illness as lepers, then, we might find it constructive to examine their situation from another point of view. If we chose to look at them as symbols rather than cases, metaphors in the language of experience or reality, what could they conceivably represent? Mirrors, surely, the circus distorting mirrors that exaggerate our every flaw. Rather than be repulsed by these images, we could find in them, on closer inspection, a high enough distortion to enable us to see more clearly what we find too small, or too close to us, to see in ourselves, the obstacles to our fulfillment as human beings. When Nazaridine saw something shiny in the gutter and picked it up, he found it was a metal mirror. Not knowing what a mirror was, he looked more closely and found the reflection of his own face. "I'm not surprised this was thrown away," he muttered to himself. "Whatever would anyone see in anything as ugly as this, I wonder?" And deciding it was not worth keeping, threw it back again. We have been examining mental illness for decades from a single point of view, that encompassed by Western psychology. There are surely many others, and the argument that these would take too much time, effort, and initiative to investigate and develop is obviously a weak one. We must think of future generations, and not only of immediately perceptible benefits, in our efforts to broaden the horizons of psychology. Nazaridine was looking over a wall one day, lost in admiration over a superb lawn, of a hue and texture that surpassed the finest velvet. He asked the gardener, busy watering the lawn, where its secret lay. The gardener explained there was no secret in it at all. It simply involved planting the lawn, weeding it, making sure it was always smooth, and cutting it at frequent intervals. Nazaridine thought this was marvellous, was all ready to rush away and make one of his own. "And about how long does it take to begin looking like this?" he asked. 800 years or so," replied the gardener. "I rather like the view from my house without grass," said Nazaridine abruptly, and hurried off. A point I would like to stress here is that perhaps the reason why psychiatrists fail in their attempts to cure mental illness is that they are in no way in real contact with the patients themselves. The sickness is one layer of the individual, and they make the mistake of treating the layer, never coming to terms with the person himself. The patient may be drugged, shocked, and put through therapy until he is a cooperative vegetable, but he will have learned nothing of ultimate use to him. The experience will slide off him, and he will remain essentially untouched. If we dismiss drugs and shock treatment as stopgap measures, we see that words are the psychiatrist's tools. It has, however, been established that language is primarily a property of only half the brain, usually the left hemisphere. How may we reach the other half? We are in need of more effective, practical methods in order to get through to the patient. Nazaridine was once called down from the roof of his house by a fakir asking for charity. Nazaridine asked why he hadn't simply called up to him, and the fakir replied that he had been ashamed to. You needn't have any false pride, Nazaridine told him, and invited him to come up with him to the roof. When they were both there and he had begun working again, he said to the fakir, I haven't got anything to give you. In some of the specialized branches of psychiatry, bioenergetics for instance, attempts are being made to include, say, the body over the course of a given therapy, rather than only to treat the mind. But this, in the end, is hardly more effective since A, the inner person remains, in most cases, entirely unaffected, and B, such therapies are in the hands of people knowing little, if anything, more in human terms than the patients themselves. Even if a wonderful new method of coping with mental illness were suddenly to arise, in the hands of an ineffective practitioner it might well be useless. Nazaridine bought some liver and was taking it home with him, carrying also a recipe for liver pie. An audacious buzzard swooped and made off with the liver. Nazaridine shouted at him, You may be glad of the meat, but I still have the recipe. A buzzard will never make a liver pie. A bad psychiatrist will never truly help a patient, whatever the outer appearances. We must become less concerned with appearances then, and more absorbed by the reality of our precarious situation. The degree of illness in any individual is only relative, as are the means we have of coping with them. Pretending that one or the other is absolute is therefore at best useless, at worst dangerous. Therapy will not make a patient well, whereas becoming attuned to his inner self, his real needs, his own potential and the real nature of his obstacles may bring him to the stage where being well is not a point of relevance, but one of relativity. He may then be in a position to carry out practices which will bring him to a stage beyond being ill or well, where he may take his place in the evolution of humanity as a fulfilled and conscientious individual. On this unscientific note, then, I would like to conclude the essay, closing with a story entitled How Nazaridine Created Truth. Laws as such do not make people better, said Nazaridine to the king. They must practice certain things in order to become attuned to inner truth. This form of truth resembles apparent truth only slightly. The king decided that he could, and would, make people observe the truth. He could make them practice truthfulness. His city was entered by a bridge. On this he built a gallows. The following day, when the gates were opened at dawn, the captain of the guard was stationed with a squad of troops to examine all who entered. An announcement was made. Everyone will be questioned. If he tells the truth, he will be allowed to enter. If he lies, he will be hanged. Nazaridine stepped forward. Where are you going? I am on my way, said Nazaridine slowly, to be hanged. We don't believe you. Very well, if I have told a lie, hang me. But if we hang you for lying, we will have made what you said come true. That's right. Now you know what truth is. Your truth. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.